Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative questions of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Geoffrey, and I'm a Methodist minister based in Putney in London. Before I was ordained, I spent 10 years working in the House of Commons as a clerk, and I'm committed to connecting how we pray and read our scriptures with how we vote and live. Each week, I'm joined by a special guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political spectrum. And today, I'm very pleased to introduce Furaha Mussanzi. Furaha is the Pastoral Care Leader for the Light Church in Bradford and the Ecumenical Canon at Bradford Cathedral. Originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Furaha and her family migrated to Bradford as refugees fleeing the war 20 years ago. Furaha's deep Christian faith is central to everything she does, and outside of her job, she is an avid storyteller, singer, and community activist. Furaha, it's lovely to have you with us today. And just so for the folks who don't know, the Light Church in Bradford, how would you describe that church?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a real privilege to be here. I would describe my church as, that's a good question. If I could choose two words, I would say that it feels like a family, and that it's also a hospital for the sick. Because I have a real heart for being in a church that is very outward looking. And I think our church is very much that. We're not, it doesn't feel like we're a club where we're trying to kind of like build ourselves, but it's kind of looking at why has God placed us here? What's going on in our city? How can we be a blessing to our neighborhood? So yeah, that I would say a family and a hospital for the sick.
Lovely. And we were talking last week to another colleague, and she was in a Baptist Methodist URC church, and she said it was a unique thing. It's a unique, we're learning that each church has its many similarities, but unique characteristics.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for being with us today. Now, we know that politics in the pulpit can be a bit of a contentious topic, but we also believe that it's essential that the world around us speaks into our churches. When you hear people saying that politics should not form part of our preaching, and I think all of us have heard something along those lines, what's your response?
I think it's really sad if we don't actually engage with what's going on in our world. I believe as Christians that we have a mandate to be light in the world. And when we look at the news and we see the challenges that is going on and right on our doorstep, never mind even going further afield, there's a lot of darkness, and there is a lot of tension between communities. There's a lot of suffering happening around us, and I think as a believer, I personally feel responsible to kind of thinking and asking God, what is my responsibility? What is it that I can do to bring your justice into the world? And I think that's a really big question because you can get overwhelmed by the reality of how can anything that I do where I am actually make a difference. It's important that we engage with the news. It's important that we keep up with what's happening around us and how these policies are affecting our local neighborhoods. The fact that, for example, in our church we have a food bank running 3 days a week is an abomination, because how can we be having kind of living in a really wealthy country, but we have people struggling to feed their kids? I just can't wrap my head around that. I mean, I've come from a background where, I've grown up in a war zone, there's a lot of struggle there. So coming to the UK and still seeing people who are homeless and seeing people who, are struggling with so many different challenges, it's really sad, but I think that it also should challenge us to think of ways that we can use our voices to be activists, to advocate for those who are voiceless in our communities. And for some people that means working in Parliament and being able to change policy, but actually I think in our own individual day-to-day lives, that can be a very practical thing of actually just looking out for our neighbours and making sure that, you know, we're able to to love them well.
Yes. Oh, thank you for that. Yes, and that challenge to be light in the darkness, which is last week's reading about, you know, don't hide your lamp under the bushel basket. Sometimes that's a very, well, it's always a very challenging thing to do, but when the darkness seems so overwhelming. And yes, I would agree entirely with you about the food poverty issue and why food banks are now just accepted as part of life here. Each week, my JPIT colleagues provide a little roundup of the news, and they've just highlighted a few stories that may or may not come into our discussions today. We are waking up this morning to news of a very significant earthquake in Syria and Turkey, and the death toll, sadly, there is continuing to rise by the hour. Today and this week is another week of strikes, especially in the NHS, with nurses and physiotherapists and ambulance drivers out this week, and very little prospect of reconciliation there. I'd also note that the Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the moderator of the Church of Scotland are on a very unusual joint trip to South Sudan to try and promote peace and reconciliation. It was wonderful to see that taking place. In the life of the church, we are in LGBT History Month in February. Lent is rapidly approaching, and after this I've got to order my Lent posters, otherwise I'll be in trouble. And most pertinently, 12th of February, the second Sunday in February, is Racial Justice Sunday. And so many churches and congregations will be perhaps departing from the lectionary readings and using other material. And Churches Together in Britain and Ireland has produced what looks like an excellent resource entitled "What's It Got to Do with Me?" So if you Google Racial Justice Sunday, you'll find those resources there. And just, I mean, it's a huge question, huge topic, but Furaha, what does racial justice mean to you, would you say?
Yeah, I think racial justice for me personally is about continuing the fight for justice, for racial justice across the world. I am obviously someone who is, you know, Black woman living in Britain, and I came here as a refugee, as a migrant, and have, you know, faced a lot of, unfortunately, lots of racial injustice and challenges, you know, even from school, being bullied for just being the color of my skin and for being different. And I think it's, you know, obviously we kind of saw the whole movement of Black Lives Matter during the pandemic, and that really raised a lot of profile about you know, racial justice issues going on across the world. But I think there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of, highlighting some of the challenges that people are still facing. And it's not just the black-white thing. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. And I believe that every community should, you know, make an effort to continue educating and raising awareness of our different communities, especially really passionate about how we educate our young people and children to start actually really grappling with this topic from a young age. And just looking at some of the systemic inequalities that still exist in, you know, workplaces, and just really challenging those things on an individual level, as well as, like, you know, on a kind of policy level.
And what do you think the role, I mean, this is a huge topic and, you know, we can't tackle it all, but what would you say specifically, do you think, is the role of a preacher in this context? I mean, it's something I know we've got in our circuit, we've got our local preachers meeting tonight. I know it's something preachers really struggle with, because it it's not popular often to bring racial justice issues into the pulpit, and people get a bit miffed at you. But what do you think the role of the preacher is in this context?
I personally believe that a preacher's role, especially in this context, is to bring challenge, because I think none of us grow, in a place of comfort. If we're constantly just wanting to hear what we want to hear, we won't be challenged. And I think personally, I always say, like, if I go to a church and I'm not being challenged in how I live and how I walk outside of church, then I need to really reevaluate why I'm there. And I think, of course, like racial justice issues, racism, those are really, really difficult topics to engage with, especially because I think people can get really, they can take it quite personally. But I think it's important that we disconnect ourselves from this being. We're not saying that, this person has said that, therefore you're racist, or this or that. But I think it's about really looking at this topic from a bird's eye view and being able to unpack it. And I think preachers especially have the responsibility to bring this topic to the congregation, and to think about, really asking those questions about what each person, challenging each person with maybe their biases, how they might view other people, other communities, those who are different to them, and being able to create a safe space to have conversations around this topic, that actually empowers people to feel that they're not, it's not a blame issue. I believe that there's a lot for us to learn about that history. If we look at just the near history, and we look at slavery, and we look at everything that happened then, and then obviously kind of a lot of the activists who came up, Martin Luther King and those who fought for justice, that we have a lot to learn in terms of how we as Christians can be at the forefront of the fight against racism. And I think, unfortunately, this is an issue that isn't going to be going away anytime soon. And if all of us just decide to run away and not engage with it, then it's just going to continue to exist. And sadly, it won't disappear.
Yes, thank you. In a London context, of course, I've learned a lot talking to people. And one of the issues, it sounds like it's such a minor story in a way, but one of the stories recently that really touched a nerve was the incident with Lady Hussey at Buckingham Palace. And the person there saying, "Where are you from? No, where are you from? Where are you really from?" And what surprises me sometimes is what stories ignite conversations, because I've had several people who, if I'm honest, are sort of more of the age and ethnicity and of Lady Hussey, and they've said, "Why is this a problem? Poor lady, poor thing. She's just got a bit muddled, and this isn't a problem. This isn't an issue." But then on the Sunday afterwards, I was surprised by how many non-white members of the congregation had their own stories. And one, I remember a young woman saying to me, she said, "When I was reading it, I just got this, I felt sick in the pit of my stomach because it just got to me." And so I think this Sunday I might be reflecting a little bit on that story as a preacher, trying to say, well, we've got to recognise the challenge of walking in another person's shoes.
Yes.
I don't know did you have any thoughts on that particular story?
I thought it was a really interesting one, because I think personally it made me think of my own story as well. As I said, kind of being a young kind of Black kid in a school where you don't really see people like you. And I would constantly, even as a 12-year-old, be asked, why are you here? Like, why did you come to the UK? And so I think it really does make one person makes you feel like you don't belong, and I think it's in the tone of how people ask a question, and how, absolutely understand that there's nothing wrong with curiosity. I'm actually someone who is incredibly curious. When I meet people who are different to me, I ask a lot of questions, because I'm just naturally wanting to know more about their culture, what makes them tick, how everything works in their tradition. So I think there is absolutely nothing wrong with being curious. But sometimes for people also who might have faced a lot of racism or trauma, it can definitely trigger them. So I think it's just being mindful of how we ask certain questions, and the tone that we use to ask that question is really, I would say, is really imperative. But as someone who is also really passionate about just allowing people to engage with these difficult topics, I think I can see where, she might have just been, wanting to know a question of like, actually, where about are you really from? Unfortunately, it's something that, you can't assume just because someone, is Black, that they're from a different place. She was like born and raised here, had actually sometimes not everybody who, who look different or look like they're from a certain place have even a connection with that place. So, being kind of British becomes a huge part of their identity. And so
I'm sorry, Charlie the cat wants to make his views clear on this subject.
Oh yeah, you're welcome to bring your views, Charlie.
Yes. Oh, thank you. I mean, thank you. That's really interesting. I was surprised that story just flashed at people, and I think it was something to do with the age and of the people involved. It sort of, people could see themselves in the story. But we need to press on, because this is a lectionary resource, and I get reminded of this every week that we're supposed to be looking at the lectionary. So let's press on and we've got 4 readings, of course. Deuteronomy 30, 1 Corinthians 3, Matthew 5, and Psalm 119. So with our metaphorical newspapers in one hand and our open Bibles in the other, let's plunge in. Where would you like to start, Furaha?
I think I'll start with the Deuteronomy, because it's just quite juicy. There's a lot to unpack.
Yes.
Yeah, so when I was reading this chapter, I remember just that some of the things that came out of it for me was, just the command to love God, love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience with him, to keep his commands and decrees, then you will live and increase. And it's basically, this instruction, for the children of Israel, is the Israelites to remember that their identity is in Christ, in God, and that they need to hold on to him as they are kind of, entering into their promised land and having the possessions that will come there. And one of the things that it talks a lot about, like prosperity and life, and you're choosing life and prosperity or death and destruction, these like 2 conflicting things. And I think for me, it really spoke to me about the importance of continuing to walk with God, and that there is a lot of, blessing and favor that comes when we walk humbly with our God. And, it reminded me also of the times when my parents and my family moved to the UK, and we found it really difficult to navigate where we fit. And I remember like our daily times of devotion, we pray together every day and like read the Bible, and just like clinging on to the promises that God had spoken over us really helped us to see God really increase us and bring more opportunities into our lives. But I think we don't always talk about the blessings that come from being obedient to God. But it's true, when you obey God, he does actually he does look after you,
Yeah. And we were saying earlier, it's such, I think both of us automatically went to this one first because it's such a dramatic text. I've set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. And there's an alternative reading, really more for our Anglican colleagues and Catholic colleagues, from the book of Sirach, which is a book I find slightly intriguing. And there he sort of paraphrases and he says, God has placed before you fire and water. Stretch out your hand for whichever you choose. Before each person are life and death, and whichever one chooses will be given. Very dramatic language there. And you were saying earlier about you setting it in the context of the Exodus narrative.
Yeah.
How do you see that working, the idea of the Exodus narrative and then choosing life or death?
Yeah, I think I really, I can really relate with the Israelites in the fact that, you know, I really feel for them, having gone through all that, walking, you know, around for 40 years and being at this crossroad where you're like, oh, finally, you know, we can go to the promised land. And actually, I think, you know, after everything that they'd been through, you know, there was a lot of consequences of, you know, their idolatry, which comes into the next part. But choosing life means like continuing to trust God for the next season. Because I think even as you know, as they're entering into their promised land, there is still, there's excitement, but there's also a lot that they're letting go of, you know, but even so, like kind of that whole slavery mentality can still carry on with them. So choosing life, and the way I understand it is about choosing to continue to be obedient and to walk with God no matter what comes their way. In the next season that they're entering.
Yes. And something that's coming to my mind, and especially as you've mentioned your own experience, your family's experience of having to flee Congo and become refugees, which must have been, I mean, how old were you at the time when you had to flee?
I was 11. That
must have been such a chilling experience for you.
It was. And you know what, actually, it's a really good point you've just raised there. I remember when we left Congo, it was a life and death situation. My parents were running a conflict resolution organization called Conflict Resolution Center. And because of their work, they were targeted by the militias at the time. So we were in danger. And I remember being in hiding for months after month. And then when we eventually got to, it's a long story, but when we eventually had the opportunity to leave, even that, being on that plane and like the plane taking off, I remember as a child just being like, almost like taking a deep breath of sigh and being like, oh my goodness, that we can actually live, you know, like it felt we were just living in that place of survival, and death was basically a very tangible thing, because every other day you'd hear news of people who got missing or been killed, and we couldn't sleep in the middle of the night because you just never knew whether you would make it to the next day. So yeah, we still feel very, very privileged that we had the opportunity to leave during that time. And of course, I still have a lot of my family back home, and my siblings and my brothers moved back to run that organization after all those years. But it's, you know, it was a very, very difficult situation. And even like the deputy of the organization 2 weeks later was killed with his family and his friends. And it just, you know, we just feel like we kind of had this near death experience where somehow God decided to take us out of the country just at the right time. So, you know, actually it's in our context, in my context, when you are given a second chance to live, you do cling on to life and you make the most of that experience, and you make the most of the opportunities that you're given. And I really believe that God brought us here so we can help others. So we've come out of our situation, but actually we're then able to support and help others to also choose life and to live life to the full, and to fulfill their potential, and not to be held down by the traumas and the struggles of every day.
Yes. Yes, it's such a, I mean, it's so powerful to hear you speak of that experience, and I'm just reminded of how this story repeats itself here in Putney. One of our neighbours, she fled as a child from the Nazis. She has very clear memories of leaving that behind, leaving everything behind, and heading to Britain. Last night, I was having dinner with some members of our congregation here who've had to flee Burma, flee Myanmar because of the conflict there. And those words, that sort of, choose life, choose death, we can interpret that rightly in a very moral tone, and we think about people making good life choices. But I'm conscious again of the refugee context. And link in Deuteronomy there, it says life and prosperity, death and adversity. And I feel very, we've got these migrants crossing the channel now, we've got migrants dying every day on the Mediterranean, and that choice that people are having to make, terrible choices of choosing life or death. And we've got families in various parts of the world who are effectively consigning themselves to death by giving all of the money to the child to go. I mean, and again, thinking in the context of racial justice, so powerful to think of what that means for so many people across our world today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think many people who make those decisions don't take those decisions lightly.
No.
They kind of, your home has to be so unbearable for you to be able to choose to live, to completely leave everything behind and make that decision, even if it does mean you might potentially die on the way. It's a very, very horrendous thing to go through.
So much to unpack there. Where would you like to go next? Because again, I get told off if we don't do at least some of them.
So I think I would like to go to, I think I found the 1 Corinthians passage quite interesting, because it's about,
so we're 1 Corinthians chapter 3.
Chapter 3, yes. And it talks about like the tension between the conflict and the quarreling that is amongst the believers there, the jealousy. And it's basically
how unlike the church today.
I know, right? I was thinking, this is so relevant. So many churches, just comparing themselves with one another instead of actually working together in unity. And I felt like kind of that whole being told off by Paul there. He was like, you are still worldly. But since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere humans? Because some of them were saying they follow Apollo, and the other one they follow Paul. And he's saying that actually, essentially, if one plants the seed and the other one waters it, it's God who is the one who makes it grow. So actually, we should be working more collaboratively as churches, as individuals, Christians, in our various different contexts. And actually, there is so much power and unity, as and actually, the world will know who we serve by seeing how united and how loving we are to one another, first and foremost. What good is it that we can go and say we love the world, but actually we hate our neighbours? we have issues.
We hate the people who sit next to us in the pew. Yes,
right. Yeah. So I think that was a real challenge. I think there's definitely a lot there that I was thinking about, even in my own context. And
it's the way that humans always find a way not to like other people. And you don't need race. You could have class or gender, or
absolutely
just speak wrong, or they come from a different place, or they take sugar in their tea, and whatever it is, we always find a way not to like somebody, don't we?
Absolutely.
This incredible human, and I think you rightly say, Paul there reminded him, you are of the kingdom. You are of the kingdom. You know, the kingdom is different. It operates on different rules.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think I love the imagery of like the planting and the seeds, and actually I think essentially I think it's in verse 7 or 8, it talks about the fact that we are co-workers in God's service. You are God's field. And I just thought that's really interesting. That actually reminded me of the fact that, you know, we're all laborers in the field of God, that it's not about kind of hierarchy and saying who is doing more for the kingdom than the other. And actually, God wants all of us to be able to use our different gifts to build his kingdom in our different contexts. Some of us could be doing that in the hospital where we're working, or some of us could be, you know, doing more community work and seeing more fruit. But actually, essentially, we're all co-workers in God's service. We're all servants of God wherever he's placed us. And I just think, like, you know, as believers, we should be encouraging one another and encouraging one another to keep doing God's work in our different contexts, and then sharing the testimonies of how God is working in us, and where the challenges might be, being able to pray for one another rather than tearing each other down, if that, for lack of better words.
And that wonderful co-workers or fellow workers, as it has in the NRSV, suggesting that we are working with God. God is tilling with us, and that enormous responsibility it places upon us.
Absolutely.
Now, we'd better go to the gospel, otherwise we're So we're in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 37, and we're continuing. Over the last few weeks, we've been traveling through the Sermon on the Mount, starting with the Beatitudes, and then Salt and Light. And then we have a collection of sayings here about anger, adultery, divorce, and oaths. Anything that struck you there about how we could link this to the field of politics in particular?
Yeah, I think for me, I was just reflecting about, like, just kind of looking at some of the ways that when you think about murder, that it's not just about like physically killing someone, but it's like it talked about our words. So being able to settle our matter, you know, if we come before God and we're trying to bring our offering and gift, but yet we have, you know, bad intentions and evil thoughts about someone in our hearts, you know, that's just as bad as potentially committing, you know, murder. And that really struck me about how powerful our words are. And if we have got, if we have issues with our neighbor or our brothers, that actually before we can even come before God, we need to go back and make sure that we are living with, that we settle those issues. Because I think it made me think of how a lot of us are, personally as well, that, you know, many of us come to church and are very good at putting on masks, and actually we're dealing with a lot of bitterness, you know, with unforgiveness and challenges that actually we can almost just continue to walk with, even though we're supposed to be letting those things go. So that's just one thing that really spoke to me about. It made me think about actually, what is it that I have in my heart that I need to deal with this week, before I go, you know, before I even go back into a church or do my normal work. It's kind of actually looking inwards and say, Lord, like, what is there is there a word that I've spoken that has been really hurtful, that could have, you know, really had been really painful for someone to hear, and being able to ask for forgiveness and make sure that I've settled those things before I even come to God and start praying or worshipping him.
Yes. And there's something, I mean, if I were being contentious, and I'm not sure I'm brave enough to preach this, I wonder if there's something about there Jesus is talking about the law, and he's saying, he's just said, you've got to keep the law. And in each case, he cites the law, but then says, you as servants of the kingdom, as my followers, are to go beyond the word of the law and to take the next step. And one thing that really distresses me about the world of politics in Westminster at the minute, and in a wider field, is the decline in honesty and the fact that we do not value honesty in our politicians. We want politicians who will tell us what we want to hear. And here we have, and we've had several politicians recently in political scandal saying, well, I kept the law, the letter of the law, I kept, but of course there was, and various politicians have come unstuck recently because it became very obvious that even if they kept to the letter, the intent was to deceive or to defraud or whatever. And there is something here about how we are being called to a higher account.
Absolutely.
Perhaps, and it's not just about what you can get away with, it's about doing justice and behaving honestly. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was going to say also, it made me think about the kind of context of, just even Congo, where we have, there's a lot of kind of tribal tensions. And actually often sometimes you have, people who are serving in church who are also affiliated with rebel groups who are actually committing, horrible crimes. And it just made me think of, just how real that can be. And even if you just go back to, actually, I think it's going to be 30 years next year when the genocide happened in Rwanda, and just some of the, actually the killings that happened, even people who were going to church were, managed to pick up their swords and kill one another. And it's just actually when you look at the whole murder and the reality of what has happened even in recent history and things, there is a lot that we can learn even there. There's a lot of work that God wants to do in us to change us from the inside out, so that we, like you said, we go beyond what we see in our world, and we live justly with one another. And it's hard, it's really challenging when you have context where there is so many tensions, where people are literally living with these like deep anger, and it just needs one thing to kind of bring it out. Unfortunately, it turns more into violence. And so I think as someone who was really passionate about like peace education, there's definitely a lot of work to be done about kind of how people, each of us can kind of look at ourselves and think about things we need to move away from, whether that's our words or in the way that we live outside. Yes.
And I think it's about starting with ourselves, isn't it? Right, I'm afraid I don't think we're going to have time for the psalm today, but that was really interesting, very challenging conversation. I think there's so many things we could explore there. And it's interesting that even though at first glance, I didn't think we'd get much about racial justice out of these readings, of course, God finds a way. So, Furaha, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your wisdom and some of your experiences and your fascinating life story, and for being so honest with us. Thank you. We really appreciate that. And thank you to everybody else who's joined us today and to discuss whether or how we should preach politics in the pulpit this week. If you've enjoyed this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on Twitter at @pulpit_politics, or using the hashtag politics in the pulpit. We also have a Facebook group, which you can access through the Joint Public Issues Team's Facebook page and the website jpit.uk. That's jpit.uk. And the question perhaps we could leave ourselves with today is, how do we achieve God's desire for true justice in this world? Where does it start? And perhaps is the answer that it starts with me. And let's go now into both our politics and our pulpits with a blessing. And I'm using a blessing here from the Church of England for their resources for Racial Justice Sunday. The blessing of God the Father, who made from one every nation that occupies the earth, of God the Son, who bought us for God from every tribe and language and people and nation, and of God the Spirit, who brings us together in unity, be with you and remain with you always. Amen. Thanks.
Amen.
Goodbye and God bless.
Thank you.